It really is an honor to be here for a lot of reasons. Not the most flattering being that back home where I live, it's about 100 degrees right now. So I'm really delighted to be here. But we did have our conference last week, brilliantly planned the third week in July in Charleston, South Carolina. So it was a great conference as long as you didn't go outside. But it is an honor to be with you here. I did speak at the first ICLE conference in Rochester. It's always encouraging when you're invited back to speak somewhere, and I thoroughly enjoyed that. And I look forward to speaking to you this morning and then tomorrow morning as well. Now, this talk is, I think I put in the description, overly ambitious. As I was discussing details with Beth Sullivan and then emailing back and forth with Andrew and Chris as well, we began to settle on some ideas, and it was mentioned to me that as this conference has grown, and it has tremendously, as this conference has grown, there are a lot of newcomers to classical education. So are there some things that we can do to sort of orient people to what classical education is? And I thought, okay, well, sure. Maybe an overview of the liberal arts themselves, the Trivium and the Quadrivium. And, well, maybe another talk on Mimetic teaching or Socratic teaching. And so it kept getting bigger and bigger as we would email back and forth and as we talked. And I thought, you know what? Let's just do all of it in one talk. And so what better name for this morning's plenary than Classical Education from a Firehose? I don't offer that to discourage you right off the bat, but I do want to try to cover a lot of ground. This morning is going to be an introduction, not so much to the Trivium and Quadrivium or the seven liberal arts themselves, as how we should begin thinking about them. And I think that that's an important change in the classical renewal, is beginning to shift the way that we think about liberal arts education anyway. And then how do we begin to think about teaching the liberal arts? One of my favorite stories is Hans Christian Andersen's The Emperor's New Clothes. Even as a little boy, I remember delighting in this story. Most of you probably know it. If not, let me give you the Reader's Digest version. It's the tale, of course, of an emperor who is swindled by a pair of so-called tailors. They claim the ability to sew a special fabric. They can sew this suit of clothes that only the wisest can see. In fact, Andersen says only those who are fit for their post, for their position in life, can see these clothes. So if you can't see them, then you're not supposed to have the job that you have. This is a very important tool for an emperor, because if his advisors or his members of his court can't see the clothing, then of course it reveals them for being frauds, for being foolish. Now, a problem arises, though, when the emperor can't see the clothes himself. The swindling tailors begin sewing this fabric, and of course they need gold to do it. They're weaving gold into it, and they come along a little later, and one of the advisors comes in and says, well, what do you think of our work so far? And they're holding up this non-existent fabric, and it's fantastic. Tell the emperor we need more gold, though. Okay, so they get more gold out of all of this. Finally, they bring the clothing in. I'm really cutting out some of the best parts of the story, hoping that you'll just go read the story. But they bring the emperor this set of clothes, and so what do you think? Of course, he's stuck. He has to pretend that he sees this. He has to pretend to put it on. The tailors, in one more insult, suggest that you put on these new clothes and then we'll throw you a parade. Right? We'll show the whole city, your whole kingdom, your whole empire, your beautiful new clothing. And so they put him on a dais, essentially, and parade him through the streets in his underwear. And everyone, knowing what's going on, has to pretend to see it. Oh, those are beautiful clothes. Ooh, ah. And everyone's going on and on about how beautiful they are. And wouldn't you know it, of course, the only one honest about it and yelling out the horribly inappropriate thing at just the worst time is a little boy. Children, right out of the mouth of babes. And a little boy yells out, essentially, "The emperor's in his underwear." And it's finally through the courage of that little boy that others begin to admit it, and the ruse is up. Most of you are here because you've seen the emperor in his underwear. Not literally, I hope. If so, then I would love to talk to you after, because there's a great story behind it. Most of us know that something's not right. Something's wrong. Whether that revelation came to you because of your background in public education, or simply in seeing that the school that you're in was not living up to the promise of what Catholic or Christian education should hold. Something is not quite right. Something is missing. And finally, you could see the emperor's not wearing any clothes. The whole thing is wrong. The whole thing is messed up. And you may feel a bit isolated. We need the faith of that little boy again to see, no, everyone else is just faking. Right? I don't have to convince you, I don't think, that the state of education in America is a bit like that. There are millions of people pretending that the emperor's clothes are beautiful, pretending that everything is just fine, pretending that if you throw more gold at the problem, it will get better. It's not working. To switch metaphors here, C.S. Lewis said in Mere Christianity, we all want progress, but progress means getting nearer to the place where you want to be. And if you've taken a wrong turning, then to go forward does not get you any nearer. If you're on the wrong road, progress means doing an about turn and walking back to the right road. And in that case, the man who turns back soonest is the most progressive man. Education in America continues to seek progress, but it's progress without definition. Innovation, but innovation in what? We don't know. If you're on the wrong road, to continue Lewis's metaphor if you don't mind, if you're on the wrong road and you start to realize your loss, hitting the gas harder doesn't do anything for you. Turn around. In other words, to put it in perhaps shocking terms, those of us who are going back to pedagogy and curriculum that are 2,500 years old are now the most progressive. By returning to classical education and liberal arts education, we're actually acknowledging we're just on the wrong road entirely. If we actually want progress, turn around. Anthony Esselin summed it up this way in the foreword of Stratford Caldecott's book, Beauty in the Word, a book that I really can't recommend highly enough. But Anthony Esselin wrote the foreword to it. Here's one of the things he said. I'm tempted to conclude that there are only two things wrong with our schools: what they don't teach our children and what they do. It's only two. That's manageable, right? He goes on to hit on something that is also worth our attention. He exposes what he means by that. He says, we suffer the consequences of a more fundamental error still. We do not know what or how to teach our children because we do not know what a child is. And we do not know what a child is because we do not know what man is, and him from whom and for whom man is. In other words, Esselin is saying we cannot properly educate without reference to the soul. Our students and teachers are made in the image of God, and so to partake of an educational system or approach to education that does not take that into consideration and does not make it the focal point is no education at all. The problem is not that the educational system is broken, it's that in the truest sense it just doesn't exist. There is no education taking place. David Hicks, the author of Norms and Nobility, said, education at every level reflects our primary assumptions about the nature of man. And for this reason, no education is innocent of an attitude toward man and his purposes. That's a very important realization. The idea of neutral education is a myth. Actually, that's an insult to myths. It's a lie. It simply doesn't have, it can't exist. The way that you teach, the way that you structure your school, the way that you select your curriculum, all of it is a reflection about your basic assumptions of the nature of man and God. Okay? And so the idea of neutral education, that is that, well, we're not anti-God or we're not trying to diminish the soul of man, we're just not talking about it. It's sort of like saying, I'm going to go the first 18 years of my child's life without telling him I love him. I'm not going to tell him I hate him, but I'm not going to tell him I love him. I wonder what the results of that would be. What damage have you done by being neutral toward your child? You haven't been neutral at all. You've spoken volumes by your silence, right? Now, I've spent a lot of time talking about things that I don't think I have to convince you of, but it was fun. Now, I'm afraid that in realizing the horrible state of American education, that the assumption of Christians, or I should say the reaction of Christians, is not to go far enough. Now, I know that I'm talking to a room full of Catholic educators, and I'm using the term Christian to reflect all traditions here, so this critique really goes across the board, all streams of Christendom. Most Christians respond to the state of American education by saying something like, well, we need to be more intentional about our spiritual instruction, theological instruction. We need to improve our religion classes. We need to spend more time, more focus on our weekly chapel or mass. Well, that's good, but it's not good enough. The reason it's not good enough is that our pedagogy, the way we teach our students, and our curriculum affect spiritual nurture and formation, not just what happens in the chapel or the religion class. That's not enough. In other words, teachers have to realize that what they do in math class also affects spiritual formation. What happens when you're teaching Latin conjugations also affects spiritual formation. You are nurturing the souls of your students all the time. All the time. Whether it's in PE or at lunch or in science or in the chapel. We cannot treat our students as if they are spiritual beings sometimes. Stratford Caldecott, again in Beauty and the Word, makes some connections that we really have to consider. And this is where I want to get into calling us back not simply to be more intentional about spiritual formation or to give more attention to spiritual instruction. I want us to see that our whole approach to education affects spiritual formation and the nurturing of our students' souls. So let me dive in here to a little bit about the Trivium and Quadrivium. In Caldecott's book, Beauty and the Word, he examines the Trivium, which has been done many times before, but he does it in a way that I've never encountered, and in a way that I think was long overdue. He examines the Trivium in light of the nature and soul of the student and the teacher. He calls for the application of those arts, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, for the application of those arts in a way that honors human nature. In other words, he's not giving you just a simple regurgitation of grammar, logic, rhetoric. You teach this in the grammar school, you teach this in middle school, you teach this in high school. In other words, what Caldecott is trying to get us to see is that the Trivium is not tied to child development. Okay? So grammar school should not be seen as ending at 5th grade. And then suddenly your students mystically, nebulously enter into the logic stage. Okay? Any more than in 9th or 10th grade, they somehow transition into the rhetoric stage. Okay, there's nothing wrong with calling it a grammar school, logic or dialectic school, and a rhetoric school. That's not what I'm saying. But we have to understand that these arts correspond to the very nature of who we are, and that's what Caldecott gets us to see. He speaks of the Trivium in more complete terms. He ties grammar to remembering. He ties logic to thinking, and then rhetoric to speaking. So instead of grammar, logic, rhetoric, Caldecott emphasizes remembering, thinking, and speaking. Now that already puts it in more of an incarnate kind of form for us. I'll come back to that, by the way. But even more significantly, Caldecott roots his understanding of the Trivium in the Trinity and the triune nature of God. He writes this about this, the Trinitarian structure. And by the way, even though this is kind of a lengthy quote, try to follow with me. This is an amazing idea. An education for freedom, he says, an education for freedom, that is a liberal education, is underpinned by a Trinitarian theology as follows. In order to be, we must remember our origin and end, the grammar of our existence. This is the beginning of all communication. Communication from God who loves us before we love Him. We come from the Father. Okay, so again, the foundational understanding is that we are being. In order to understand being, we must remember our relation to the Father. In discovering the Father, we become thinkers. So being, thinking. We awaken thought in ourselves, which is the following of the light of truth, walking with the Son, the Logos incarnate, leading to the face-to-face knowledge of the Father that only the Son possesses and those with whom He shares it. That sharing is done through the Spirit, the breath of the Father that carries the Word. Communication is closely related to communion. The Spirit is the rhetoric of God. So again, remembering, thinking, speaking. That's how Caldecott calls us to understand the Trinity in the Trivium as tied to the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and who we are as beings made in His image. This is what it actually means to learn, to be educated. It means to remember, to think, and to speak. So for Caldecott, a Christian understanding of the Trivium is rooted not simply in pedagogical or historical knowledge, but in the character of God Himself. In other words, returning back to classical education, even though at times it may feel, and you have to justify this to parents in your school and so on, it's not really a return to the pagans. God, in His kindness, allowed the pagans to understand something that was woven into the very fabric of the universe, the very fabric of existence. And if anyone should understand that, Caldecott's telling us, it's the Catholic liberal tradition, right? So this is, when I say turn around and go back because we're on the wrong road, especially as Catholic educators, you need to understand this is reclaiming your tradition. This is reclaiming your identity as Catholic educators. Because we are made in the image of God, and the Trivium is rooted in the character of God himself, this is a return back to true Christian education. The students in your class are God's image bearers. Yes, even that one. Right. I think most of you probably had that moment in your mind. You're going, wait a minute. I believe that, but I don't want to. No. The students in your class, every boy, every girl, are God's image bearers. Do you think that should affect how you teach them? Caldecott also wrote, education is not primarily about the acquisition of information. It is not even about the acquisition of skills in the conventional sense, to equip us for particular roles in society. It is about how we become more human and therefore more free in the truest sense of that word. Too often we have not been educating our humanity. We have been educating ourselves for doing rather than for being. Now here's the point that I want you to draw out from this sort of highlight on the Trivium. It's very simple. When we teach our students, we want them to learn to behold the truth, not just memorize facts. Okay? Now, this means equipping them to remember, to think, and to speak. Not as skills, but as aspects of their being. Right? Now let me continue. I promise you I'm going to draw together a lot of this into very practical things in just a little bit. But we need to understand the Trivium in light of the Trinity and the fact that man is made in the image of God. Now, what about the Quadrivium? Is this a new term? How many of you are kind of unfamiliar with what we mean by the Quadrivium? Okay. Actually, a lot of people in the world of classical education are just now coming around to really understand and be aware of what the Quadrivium is. In fact, for a long time, the idea has been that the Trivium is sort of the end-all of classical education, particularly kindergarten through 12th grade education. And we're just now coming around to understand that. So I think some of you maybe are ahead of that, and if you're not, then you are certainly not alone. Recently, there was a book written called The Liberal Arts Tradition by Ravi, Jain, and Kevin Clarke. This is another book that I would really recommend. I know at conferences like this, you leave with just a long list of books that you're supposed to read. I know it's a little overwhelming, but I really do recommend this one because I think it helps you get a grip on the liberal arts as a whole and what that looks like in the classroom, really. And it's short. I think it's only about 140 or 150 pages, so it's a very good introduction. Again, it's called The Liberal Arts Tradition. Ravi, Jain, Jain, and Kevin Clarke. Conveniently available from the Circe Institute bookstore. You can get it at a lot of places. That we do sell a lot of them because it is very much worth the read. They mention this transition near the beginning of their book. They write, the Christian classical renewal is indebted to the insights Dorothy Sayers enumerated in her famous essay, The Lost Tools of Learning. Many of you are probably familiar with it. In fact, that's kind of a gateway into classical education for a lot of us. And to the vision for the recovery of those tools that Doug Wilson pioneered in his foundational book, Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning. Their identification of the crisis in modern education as the failure to cultivate these traditional arts of learning is prophetic. In addition to this, their exposition of the classical educational tradition especially the Trivium, has affected a seismic shift in Christian education. They then go on to say, hitherto thinkers in the renewal have understood the Trivium itself as constituting the Christian classical curriculum. And so what Jain and Clarke are calling us to is to move past that. That's a good start, right? It's a good start, but that's not where you end. In fact, I would argue Dorothy Sayers wasn't even trying to define classical education at all. In fact, she doesn't even mention it in her essay. She's just describing what was wrong with education in England at the time. She'd be really horrified now. I can't imagine what she would say. But she does introduce those stages of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and she does tie them to child development. But what Jain and Clarke are trying to get us to see in their book, The Liberal Arts Tradition, is that, okay, that's more of a diagnosis of a problem than it is the solution. So let's move past that. Their description of the Trivium, Clarke and Jain's description of the Trivium, goes well beyond that idea of the Trivium as 3 stages. They build on the medieval saying that grammar speaks, dialectic or logic teaches words, and rhetoric colors words. I think that's a great way to understand it as well. Grammar speaks, logic teaches words, and rhetoric colors words. So the Trivium has to be coupled with the Quadrivium. That's what Clarke and Jain are arguing. Because the Quadrivium, put together, or I should say the 7 liberal arts, they say lay the paths to all further studies rather than being the end-all of classical education. So we have to move past this idea that somehow grammar, logic, and rhetoric, just the Trivium, that's classical education. That's not true. That's only a part of the puzzle. Classical education includes the 7 liberal arts. And in fact, at Circe, this is the way that we define classical education. It's kind of a lengthy definition, but I think it encapsulates everything together. Classical education is the cultivation of wisdom and virtue by nourishing the soul on truth, goodness, and beauty by means of the 7 liberal arts and the 4 sciences. It's the natural sciences, human sciences, theological sciences, philosophical sciences. I don't expect you to have written all that down. But the point is that classical education includes all 7 of the liberal arts and has as its aim and purpose and identity the cultivation of wisdom and virtue. That's what classical education is about. That's the aim. Now, in addition to that, classical education understands that Christ is the integrative principle, the center, the logos. Everything else, everything flows out of Christ as being the integrative principle, the source of all truth, knowledge, wisdom, virtue, goodness, and beauty. Now, as I think Caldecott was arguing, classical education, and I hope that I'm not assuming too much here of what he was saying. Caldecott was gracious in the way that he wrote, so I'll take more of an Anthony Eslin approach and just be really blunt about it. I love that guy. The only truly Christian education is classical education, because it's the only form of education that takes in mind the soul of the student and the nature of the student, the fact that he is made in the image of God. It is the only form of education that requires and calls teachers to teach in the way that students learn. And they learn that way because they've been made in the image of God. Now, a Christian understanding of education requires more of us than taking modern progressive models and tacking on a religion class. Let's be honest. What most of our schools have done, over the years. Christian schools in the broad general sense, and Catholic schools included among them. I know I attended all of grammar school in one. What we do is we take the progressive modern model of education, we add a religion class, and we expect vastly different results. Then we scratch our heads going, what are we doing wrong? Everything else. You've added the religion class. Great. You take them to chapel every week. Great. But you're doing everything else that the rest of the world is doing and expecting vastly different results. It's not happening. A Christian understanding of education means that because we are made in the image of God and our students are made in the image of God, our schooling must educate our humanity. And that means that the goal of education must be the cultivation of wisdom and virtue, not the achievement of a certain standardized test score, not admission to a certain college or any other peripheral goal. And that brings us back to the last blast from the Firehose, which is our pedagogy. If we understand that liberal arts education is tied to the nature of the child, and as Christians we understand that it calls us back to educating our humanity and educating a child as a being made in the image of God, then of course it requires us to teach differently. How does it affect our pedagogy? How does it affect our teaching? Well, this brings me to a very important point, and I think I made this point when I spoke at the conference in Rochester. That is, we have to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of education in the first place? What I've been trying to get at is that the purpose of education is the cultivation of wisdom and virtue. It's nurturing the souls of our students on truth, goodness, and beauty through the 7 liberal arts. And if the goal, if the purpose is cultivating wisdom and virtue, then we have to teach in a way that cultivates wisdom and virtue. Now, classical teaching, or teaching the liberal arts, is done in, I wouldn't say approaches, it's certainly not methods, but it's done through mimetic and Socratic teaching. Now, mimetic, M-I-M-E-T-I-C. These are not two different methods. They're like two sides to the same coin. This is just classical teaching. It's what it looks like to teach in the liberal arts tradition. We have to be driven by our purpose, not by a method. Okay? So I don't want you to see this little bit of a talk on mimetic and Socratic teaching. I don't want you to view that as kind of a checklist sort of mentality. Rather, this is something that you want to embody in your teaching, embody in your classroom before your students. Socrates was not driven by a method. Okay? He didn't roam around asking questions because he just really liked annoying people. Okay? And let's be honest, if you read the dialogues, he really could get annoying after a while. I mean, I know this, you're a classical educator, you can't say that. He was, you know, stop with all the questions. No, he did it not because he was driven by this method going, I must ask more questions, but because he was aiming to cultivate wisdom and virtue in himself and in those that he talked to. And because of that, it led him to certain kinds of inquiry, certain ways of teaching. Why? Because those ways of teaching led to the cultivation of wisdom and virtue. So his purpose determined his approach, not the other way around. Mimetic instruction is founded on the truth that God has made us to learn by imitation. Why do we teach through mimesis? And I'll describe this here in just a second. We teach through mimetic instruction, that is embodying truth, because we learn by imitation. We all know this. Not just mimicking, but by genuine imitation. We try to embody what is presented to us. We try to embody the truth that we see. We embody what we behold. So the most important thing we do as teachers is to direct our students to behold or contemplate the right things. We teach our students how to behold, how to contemplate, because transformation occurs through gazing. Transformation occurs through contemplation. And so we want to teach in a way that helps our students, like Clarke said, remember, think, and speak. Now, how do we do that? When a teacher practices mimetic teaching, it really boils down to embodying the truth and letting them look at it. Now, if you want stages for this, here it is. I'll condense it for lack of time. I have no idea when I started, and I don't have a watch on, and I'm going to pretend that my phone doesn't have a clock on it. What time do I need to end, by the way? 2?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so I have a little bit of time. And I want to leave time for questions, too. But mimetic teaching starts with, well, preparation, of course. So as a teacher, if you're going to embody the truth, you have to know what it is. Simple enough, right? There's nothing all that complex about that. What is the truth? What is the logos that I'm trying to teach my students? What do I want them to learn today? Now, when I use the word truth, I don't want you to just have theological, philosophical terms in mind. Yes, you could be teaching the truth of, I don't know, a monarchy. What is a monarchy? Okay. You could be teaching about justice. Okay, that is abstract. You have to find ways to embody that too. You could be teaching the distributive principle. Okay? You could be teaching first declension in a Latin class, right? So whatever it is, what am I trying to embody? What is the truth? Okay, now, how do I embody it? How do I incarnate that to them? So let's say you're teaching about the British monarchy. The first story that pops in my mind is Alfred the Great, because it's just a great story. So what are you going to do to draw the student to see the truth about a monarchy, what a monarchy is? Well, you could, now, and this is what a lot of us do, you could write the term monarchy up on the board and then a definition, and then have them scribble it in their notes so that they may promptly forget it and tune out until it's time for the test, right? Now, if your purpose in education is to get them to memorize stuff that you write on the board, mission accomplished. If, however, your purpose is to go beyond that so that they may remember, think, and speak, grow in understanding and knowledge, understanding, and wisdom, well, you've got to show them something. And we all know that, we've all been there in that seat where we've all had that teacher that they write up the term, they write up the definition, and that's really what you got out of the class, right? You got notes scribbled down in your notebook from the chalkboard. That's not what we're after, though. So what do? You tell them stories. In telling them stories, you're presenting types. If you want to teach about the monarchy, tell them about monarchs. Tell them stories about kings, about battles, about difficult succession. I can tell you, if you write up a bunch of facts about Alfred the Great, dates and dead people, you know, that approach to history, if you want them to do that, fine. And they will grow to hate history. It's a perfect way to take a living subject and kill it If, however, you want them to understand, tell them stories. What do you think a child's soul is going to respond to? The definition of a monarchy and a bunch of dates about Alfred the Great? Or the story of when he had to decide whether or not to pay the Danegeld, which was just paying gold to the Vikings, the Norsemen, as they came over, hoping that they wouldn't attack. And in the meantime, building his army while retreating through the forest, where he met a little old lady who was willing to hide him and his army. And this lady reminds me of my own grandmother. She put him to the task of watching the bread as it baked over the fire. Don't let it burn, she told the king. You know. He sort of dozed off thinking about his own problems, wallowing in his own sympathy, and he let the bread burn, and she comes back and smacks him over the head. It says, oh, I see. You're willing to eat the bread when it's done, but you're not willing to do the work to get it there. That was a turning point in Alfred's life, in his reign. He realized, I'm the king. This is really not supposed to be easy. I've got to stop wallowing in self-pity here and actually make the hard decisions. Now, is a child going to be more interested in a little old lady smacking the king on the back of the head, or going, on such and such a date? This is embody the truth, right? The same with the distributive principle. You go, wait a minute, I teach math. I don't have any good stories. Yes, you do. Every math problem is a story. Every math problem is a type. Every math problem is an embodiment of the truth. Anytime you show a student in concrete examples of what math is and what math does, you're embodying the truth to them. If it's abstract, embody it. Now, if they're really young kids, then the use of manipulatives here, I mean, obviously you're all familiar with that, that's embodying truth, right? That's incarnating it to them. As they get older, you can do the same thing with different types, different examples, okay? So what is the truth or the logos I'm trying to teach? How can I embody it? Whether it's stories or manipulatives or whatever it is. How do I teach them? Some of you have an easier time with it. Science teachers, you really have it good here. Because whether it's leaves or skeletal systems, right? You have just tons and tons of types that you can put in front of them. So as you prepare, what is the truth that I'm trying to teach? And then what are some of the types that I can use to teach it? Some of the examples that I can use to embody this. And then present the types to them. Show them. If you're studying skeletal systems, then show them different examples of them. Let them look at it. Let them see it. Let them perceive it. Let them behold it. And then that leads to another stage of mimetic teaching, which is the comparison of different types. Okay? If I'm teaching history, one of the most important things I do, and I've taught history for years, if I'm telling the story of Alfred the Great, and the idea is what is a good king, or what is a monarch, how is a monarchy set up, whatever the idea is. I'm going to tell them the story of Alfred the Great, but I'm going to contrast it, compare it with other stories of kings, right? Tell them about a bunch of kings. And what are they doing in their heads when you tell them these different stories? They're comparing, right? And they're comparing without you even having to tell them to compare. We compare and contrast all the time. It's how we learn. It's so woven into who we are that we do it without even realizing it. In fact, right now, if you look around the room, this is an easy example to use, and I think I've used it before. If you look around the room, you're making comparisons. Every single person you look at, you're comparing and contrasting with someone else. In fact, that's how you know that this guy is not this guy. I'm sorry, I don't know your name, so, you know. But yeah, it is true. That's right. That guy's not that guy. How do I know that? Because in my head, I've already compared. He has a beard. He doesn't. He has on a red shirt. He doesn't. Right? You get the idea. It's how we learn. It's how we make evaluations. So get them to compare types with whatever you're showing. If it's simple addition, show them different problems and how they work. How are they alike? How are they different? Is this different from what we've learned before? The same in science, history, whatever you're teaching them. You're making comparisons of that particular type that you're showing them right now with other types that you've shown them before. So how is this alike? How is it different? And what is that doing? You're drawing out what they already know. You're drawing out what they're noticing. You're drawing out what they've already begun contemplating. And in drawing that out, you're getting them to better understand it, to better master it. So, I can write a definition of a monarch up on the board. And that's not necessarily wrong. But if I stop there, I haven't really taught them anything. They can regurgitate that definition on a quiz, but they won't remember it. If I tell them about kings, about monarchs, they're going to remember, and they'll probably be able to articulate a better definition than what I wrote on the board. Now, what happens in the course of doing that? They're not just memorizing definitions, they're contemplating. And you're not having to beg them to do it, they're just remembering. They're seeing it. They're seeing the comparisons of skeletal systems that you showed them. They're paying attention to the differences. They're noting in the consistencies or inconsistencies of their math problems how this actually works. Now, because they're contemplating, they can then move on even beyond that into understanding and expression. So now we're back to, as Caldecott said, remembering. That is, once they see the truth incarnate, they see the type, they can get it. They can remember it. It's part of their knowledge now. But we want to go beyond that. Can they think about it? Can they show comparisons, contrasts? And then finally, can they speak? Remember? Remember, thinking, remembering, thinking, speaking. Now, how do we want them to speak? Is it just oral presentations? No, not necessarily. Can the student express the truth back to you? Can they show you? As you're doing simple addition, you've shown them examples, you've given them different types, different presentations of the truth, different offerings of the truth in front of them, getting them to gaze at it, contemplate it, think about it, ponder it, contrast it, compare it, and now it's your turn. Show me. Can you do this one on the board? Can you give me an example of a good king? What is a king supposed to do? What made Alfred the Great great and Harold the Unfortunate so unfortunate? The British always had great nicknames for their kings, didn't they? Ethelred the Unready. You know. My favorite, he wasn't actually English, he was a Viking invader, but my favorite nickname was Swin Forkbeard. Do you know that story? Oh, I don't have time for it, but he had a long beard that he would braid like Gimli. You know, that tells you my perception of reality. I'm using Gimli as the real one and Swin as the... I prefer it that way, yes. Now, as they're expressing the truth back to you, and showing their mastery of it, their understanding of it, this is where Socratic questioning comes in. Okay? So again, it's part of mimetic teaching, and mimetic teaching is part of Socratic teaching. You've presented the truth. You've let them contemplate it. They're now expressing it back to you. What if they're mistaken? This is where Socratic questioning comes in. Socratic questioning is meant to correct error. Okay? It's not the driving force behind your teaching. It's meant to expose and correct error. So where did they go wrong? Right? Okay, now how do you identify that? Well, you ask them. Don't just tell them that they're wrong and give them the right answer instead. If they say, well, no, I think that's a cat's skeletal system, and in reality it's a primate. So, well, what makes you think that that's a cat? Okay, what does a cat look like? What are his features? Do you notice anything different here? Do you remember when we looked at the primate skeletal system? What did you notice about that? So as you're bringing this out and responding to their answers, you're guiding them back to the truth itself. The same in math. If they're doing simple addition and they have 4 plus 4 is 9, okay, well, can you show me 4? We'll even use, if they're at the board, we'll even use just tally marks. Can you just show me 4? 4 lines. Okay, what if you had 4 more lines? Can you count them up for me? Now, what do you come to? Oh, it's 8. What have you done? You've asked them questions that brought up their mistake, and what have you done again? You've embodied the truth for them yet again. So this is the goal, is getting them to remember, be able to think through it, contemplate the truth, and then speak it, to show it, that they've mastered it. So this is at the heart, really, of mimetic teaching. This is just a kind of quick overview of it. Now, mimetic instruction is rooted in the idea that as human beings made in the image of God, we learn by imitation, and we learn from the specific to the general. Okay? We're finite creatures. And we're in one place doing one thing at one time. Even multitasking is a myth. Right? So we learn from the specific to the general. And so it's best to teach people with the grain, as Dorothy Sayers said it, and mimetic instruction is a way to take your students from the very specific, this embodiment of the truth, this embodiment of the Logos, to the general. Now notice what you've done. Through a handful of types, a handful of examples, you've taught them a truth that goes way beyond those examples. Telling them the story of Alfred the Great and then comparing it with Ethelred the Unready does far more than just tell them the story of Alfred the Great and Ethelred the Unready. You're telling them what a king ought to be. They're learning what it means to be in positions of responsibility, to make difficult decisions, to endure times of hardship. They're learning that succession is difficult. They're learning that sometimes the fate of nations are in the hands of people who really aren't prepared for it. In other words, you've taught them history. Not a historical fact, but history. By showing them models of addition or subtraction or whatever, you've shown them truth, not just a math problem. Mimesis is also incarnational. It means that we're embodying truth to our students, and that is a beautiful, beautiful thing. And it's liberating. I know that I've said this before, but I don't want to assume that anyone remembers it. I have to remind myself of this too, that mimetic teaching is liberating. Why teach this way instead of teaching for the test? I mean, after all, if you teach to the test, then you know you've covered the material, right? But let me ask you this. Again, what is the purpose of education? Is it to cover the material? Is it to know that all of the hard work was worth it because I got through the book? I left the kids behind in October, but I got through the book. Is it to know that come April or so, they're going to fill in more correct bubbles and therefore be fully prepared for a job in the DMV or some other bureaucracy? Or is it to nurture their souls on truth, goodness, and beauty, to know that they know how to contemplate now? You've helped them learn to remember. You've helped them learn to think. You've helped them learn to speak. You've helped them learn to see and embrace truth wherever it's found. If that's the goal, then this is the way that we have to teach. It's liberating. And it's liberating in multiple ways. We want our students to no longer need us. You know that you've done a good job when your students don't need you anymore, because they understand the truth, they remember it, they've contemplated it, and they can express it. It's part of them now. That's what a liberal arts education is. That's what it means. Liberal meaning free or freeing. We have a poster at Circe that says classical education because free people rule themselves, as in govern themselves. That's what liberal arts education is about. It's about setting their soul free to embrace truth, goodness, and beauty. They don't need their teacher to perceive and express the truth anymore because they've been set free. But this also liberates teachers. Think about what this does to your lesson plans. Think about how much more fun this is to teach than just turning around with your backs to the kids writing notes on the board all day. You're actually teaching them. You're embodying truth. You're learning with them. If you teach mimetically, you will be shocked at what your students teach you. And what you are able to teach them. This is how teachers learn to teach from a state of rest. Teaching is anxious business because we're doing it incorrectly. This is easier because it's teaching with the grain. It's how you learn. It brings out creativity in you, energy in you, and it's teaching with the grain of your students because it's how they learn. Andrew Kern, the president of the Circe Institute, has put it this way in talking about mimetic teaching himself. You don't have to teach this way. But if you want your students to learn, you will. This is not a gimmick. It's simply the way that we all learn. Now, I've covered way too much stuff over probably way too much time. Do we have some time for questions and comments? Okay. I didn't go into as much detail as I had hoped, but fire hoses aren't really gentle, are they? Sorry. Yes, sir.
So I got a degree in secondary education through the University of Phoenix. And it's my impression, the way that I was taught, is that there's a real desire to teach students, not a subject, but
Right.
students. I can see that the intention is there, that they want, they talk about, you're not teaching to the test, you're not, they just don't have this model. Okay, there's a lot of methods,
Right.
strategies. I could see there's a lot of good things, that it sounds like they want that, but they're not putting it in the same words, I would say, that you are.
Okay.
It's not clear. I was confused, I have to say. I'm just wondering if, I don't know if you're familiar with the state kind of approach, but again, I took it. I don't know if anybody else has or sees the same thing, but there's a real desire, and I see there's a lot of good intentional teachers out there who see that there's more to teaching than just writing on the board, and I
Right.
think they're trying to stay away from notes and all that.
Right.
So I don't know if you can comment.
Yeah. Well, I would say a couple of things. One, there are, I don't know how to put a figure on it, but there are tons of teachers in the public educational system who genuinely are concerned about their students, love their students, want to do right by them. And honestly, I have friends who are Christians as well, who work in those systems, and they understand the brokenness of the system better than we do. They're in it. They understand the brokenness of it. Some of them, given that Mimetic and Socratic teaching have been used in non-Christian contexts, some of them are trying to return to a lot of that. And actually the way that some subjects are taught, that's a whole other discussion. The fact that they're subjects is another discussion. But in teaching math, you almost have to embody it. There's really, it's the way that you teach it. There's not much else you can do. Science is generally the same way. There is a desire to get beyond just teaching students to the test, and I think it's encouraging to see that, even in the public school realm. The problem, though, is one that I think is inescapable, and it's simply this: that given that the world and all that is in it was created by God, that man is made in the image of God, and that truth, goodness, and beauty do exist in an eternal sense, if you take God and the soul of man out of the picture, you're always going to cut yourself off at the knees. There's only so much you can do, right? So I think that there are teachers who want to move beyond just simply teach to the test and that kind of mentality, but they're very limited. It doesn't mean that they can't do good. I think many of them do. But they're limited because they are a part of a system that simply does not acknowledge the soul of man. And as Esalen says, nor him from whom man comes. And when you do that, you're really limiting what you can't really get to the heart of education.